The winter sky over Europe in 1943 was a place of constant thunder. Heavy bombers droned in formation, their silver wings flashing in the pale sunlight as they pushed toward their targets deep inside enemy territory. Below them, black clouds of flak burst open like poisonous flowers, and from above and behind, enemy fighters tore through the air with the speed of knives. Inside one of those bombers, a 19-year-old gunner clutched his controls. The fuselage shook with every near miss. Metal shrieked, glass shattered, and holes opened in the aircraft's skin as if invisible hands were tearing it apart. By the time the surviving planes limped back to base, their bodies were riddled with holes, hundreds of them scattered across wings and tail like scars of survival. On the ground, teams of mechanics and engineers rushed forward, sketching diagrams of the returning aircraft. They plotted each bullet hole, each fragment strike, onto careful maps of the bomber's silhouette. Soon patterns emerged. Over and over, bombers showed clusters of damage along the wings and fuselage. And curiously, the cockpit and engines appeared nearly untouched. For the commanders, the conclusion was obvious. Armor the areas that were hit most often. More steel on the wings and body, they insisted. That's where our planes are taking the punishment. Plans were drawn, calculations made, and shipments of extra plating prepared. It seemed like common sense. If a place is full of bullet holes, that must be the place that needs more protection. But sometimes common sense is the enemy of truth. Far from the roar of engines and the scream of battle, in a quiet room in New York, a different kind of soldier studied the same charts. He carried no weapon. His battlefield was made of numbers. He noticed not just what was there but what was missing. And he asked a question no one else thought to ask. What about the planes that didn't come back? That single question cracked the problem open. The bullet holes on the surviving aircraft weren't just marks of damage, they were clues. They whispered that planes could endure hits in those places and still fly home. But the areas without bullet holes? That silence was deadly. If a bullet struck the engine or the cockpit or the control lines, that plane never returned to be counted. The insight was as simple as it was radical. The absence of evidence was itself evidence. Protect the places where you saw no damage because those were the hits no plane could survive. That reversal, that small act of mathematical imagination, would save countless lives in the war. And its lesson would echo far beyond the skies of Europe, shaping how we think about data, bias, and the unseen dangers in every field of life. This is the story of how math turned bullet holes into a life-saving map. The autumn of 1943 marked one of the darkest chapters for Allied bomber crews over Europe. From the moment their engines roared to life on chilly English airfields, every crew member knew the odds. The orders were simple but terrifying. Fly in formation across hundreds of miles of hostile airspace, drop bombs on German factories and return alive if luck permitted. Luck, however, was in short supply. A standard mission might begin at dawn. Dozens upon dozens of B-17 flying fortresses would roll down the runways, their propellers chopping the cold air into a deafening rhythm. Ground crews stood at attention, watching as their friends and brothers disappeared into the clouds. Everyone knew that many of those bombers would never return. As the formations crossed into occupied territory, the sky would come alive with explosions. German anti-aircraft cannons, flak guns, filled the air with jagged black bursts. Each cloud hid shards of metal, invisible blades capable of slicing through an aircraft's skin, shredding fuel tanks, or severing control cables. Meanwhile, swarms of enemy fighters, sleek and fast, streaked in from above, their machine guns and cannons spraying death at incredible speeds. Inside a bomber, the crew faced chaos. The roar of engines, the constant chatter over the intercom, the sharp metallic rattle of their own guns firing back, all blended into a storm of sound. Frost clung to the glass windows, and the thin air at high altitude bit through heavy jackets. But it was the sudden jolts, the sickening thuds when enemy fire punched holes in the fuselage, that reminded every man aboard just how fragile their fortress truly was. When the bombers finally staggered back across the channel, those that made it looked like survivors of a brutal brawl. Their wings were torn, their tails shredded, their metal skins perforated with holes. Some landed on only 2 functioning engines. Others rolled to a stop with fuel streaming behind them, their crews climbing out pale and trembling but alive. At first glance, these survivors seemed like invaluable data. Army engineers rushed to examine them, clipboards in hand. Each aircraft was studied like a patient after surgery. Where had the bullet struck? Which areas were most damaged? Which parts of the bomber appeared most vulnerable? Soon a pattern emerged. The fuselage, the long central body of the plane, often looked like it had been stitched with bullets. Dozens, even hundreds, of holes could be counted. The wings were also frequently damaged, their broad surfaces easy targets for enemy fire. And yet, curiously, the engines, cockpit, and vital control lines showed surprisingly little harm. For commanders looking at the charts, the conclusion appeared undeniable. Armor the places that take the most hits, they argued. If the fuselage and wings are riddled with holes, then those are the sections crying out for protection. It sounded logical. It sounded practical. But above all, it sounded urgent because the casualty rate was catastrophic. At that time, the U.S. 8th Air Force required bomber crews to complete 25 missions before being sent home. But in late 1943, the odds of surviving all 25 were less than 1 in 3. Imagine sitting in the belly of a bomber, counting off each mission, knowing the mathematics were stacked against you. Each time you strapped yourself in, you were gambling with your life. The situation was not just a human tragedy, it was a strategic disaster. Heavy bombers were essential to the Allied plan. They were the long arm that could reach deep into German industrial centers, crippling factories, rail yards, and fuel depots. Without them, the pressure on Nazi Germany would weaken. Yet if losses continued at the current rate, there wouldn't be enough bombers or men left to carry on the fight. In briefing rooms, generals and analysts pored over damage diagrams. They pointed to the black clusters on the bomber silhouettes. Here, they said, tapping the fuselage, here's where they are being shot. We must reinforce these sections. It was an understandable conclusion, and a dangerously wrong one. Because those diagrams told only half the story. The truth of war often hides in silence, in the voices never heard and the planes never seen again. For every bomber limping back full of bullet holes, another had vanished in flames, crashing into fields or seas, its crew lost forever. And those lost bombers, the ones that never returned to be examined, carried a different pattern of damage, a pattern no one could yet see. At first, no one questioned this blind spot. To the military, the evidence seemed overwhelming, reinforced the visibly damaged parts. But mathematics has a way of cutting through intuition, revealing truths that emotion and urgency obscure. It was in this moment, with lives hanging in the balance and strategy teetering on the edge of failure, that the problem was handed to a small group of mathematicians in New York. Hidden away in unremarkable buildings, far from the smoke of battle, these quiet thinkers faced a question that brute force couldn't answer. Where should the armor really go? Far from the battlefields of Europe, in the bustling heart of New York City, a quiet group of intellectuals worked behind blackout curtains. The building that housed them was nothing remarkable, an ordinary apartment structure near Columbia University. Passers-by might have assumed it held professors, students, or perhaps government offices. In reality, it sheltered one of the most unusual and powerful weapons of the war: mathematics. This secretive unit was known as the Statistical Research Group, or SRG for short. It was a strange hybrid of academia and military urgency. Within its walls worked some of the finest mathematical minds in America, men and women pulled from universities and research institutes. Their task was not to wield rifles or fly planes, but to apply logic, probability, and equations to the messy chaos of combat. Among them was Abraham Wald, a man whose journey to that room had been anything but ordinary. Wald was born in 1902 in what was then Austria-Hungary, in a town that would later become part of Romania. His family was Jewish, deeply religious, and not wealthy. From an early age, Abraham displayed a gift for numbers that astonished everyone around him. Because his community had restrictions on school attendance, his parents homeschooled him, providing the basics. But even without formal instruction, young Abraham soared through complex problems that baffled most adults. By the time he reached university, his mathematical talent was undeniable. He earned a doctorate in geometry and quickly became respected in academic circles across Europe. Yet history had cruel timing. In 1938, when Nazi Germany annexed Austria, Jewish scholars like Wald suddenly found themselves excluded, threatened, and hunted. His career in Vienna ended overnight. With few options, Wald fled, carrying little more than his intellect. Eventually, he made it to the United States, where Columbia University offered him refuge. It was there, surrounded by the safety of New York but haunted by the knowledge of what was happening in Europe, that he continued his research. When America entered the war, Wald was recruited into the SRG. For him, mathematics was no longer just about abstract theories or elegant proofs. It was about survival, the survival of men he had never met, flying missions thousands of miles away. The bomber problem arrived at his desk in the summer of 1943. Boxes of reports and diagrams filled with bullet hole maps were delivered to the SRG offices. Each report represented hours of meticulous work by ground crews in England, counting, measuring, and charting every puncture in the returning aircraft. The Air Force wanted the SRG to provide a solution, a precise calculation of where armor plating should be added. 4 days Wald sat silently with the data. Colleagues remembered him puffing his pipe, scribbling notes, then staring into space as though the answers floated just beyond reach. Others had already started crunching numbers the obvious way: tally the hits, weight them by frequency, and recommend armor where holes appeared most often. But Wald wasn't convinced. The more he studied the diagrams, the more he felt something was missing. The wings, the fuselage, the tail surfaces, yes, they were riddled with holes. But wasn't it strange that the engines, the cockpit, and the most delicate control areas seemed almost untouched? Could it really be that German gunners consistently missed the most vital parts of the plane? One afternoon, in a quiet meeting with his fellow researchers, Wald finally spoke. His words were calm but carried the weight of revelation. "You are all looking at this problem backwards," he said. "The data shows us only the planes that returned. But what about the planes that never came back?" The room fell silent. He walked to the chalkboard, drew the outline of a bomber, and shaded in the fuselage and wings where most of the damage appeared. "This," he explained, "is the pattern of survivorship. These are the areas that can take heavy fire and still allow the plane to limp home. Every hole we see here is proof that a bomber could endure that damage." Then he marked the engines, cockpit, and control cables. "Now look here. These places show little damage in the data not because they are safe, but because planes struck in these areas did not return. Their stories are missing from your reports. We are listening only to the survivors." It was a breathtaking shift in perspective. Instead of focusing on the visible scars, Wald was asking his colleagues to imagine the invisible losses, the silent evidence buried in wreckage scattered across Europe. This was the essence of what he would later describe as survivorship bias. The tendency to draw conclusions from the winners, the survivors, while ignoring those who failed and thus left no trace in the dataset. In war as in life, the dead do not speak. But their silence can be more revealing than the loudest testimony. Wald began constructing equations to formalize his intuition. He assumed enemy fire was largely random. Flak bursts and fighter bullets sprayed across the air with no surgical precision. If so, then statistically the distribution of hits should be roughly uniform across an aircraft's surface. Any large deviations from uniformity in the surviving planes meant something crucial. Hits to the missing areas were disproportionately fatal. The conclusion was unavoidable. Armor should not go where the holes were densest. It should go where the holes were absent. Engines needed reinforcement. The cockpit required protection. The control cables that allowed pilots to maneuver had to be shielded. These were the true Achilles heels of the bomber, the weak points that decided whether 10 men lived or died. When Wald presented this reasoning to military officials, many were skeptical at first. To commanders accustomed to seeing with their own eyes, the idea of armoring places that seemed untouched felt counterintuitive. But the mathematics held. By showing that the absence of damage was itself a form of data, Wald turned the Air Force's thinking upside down. This quiet, pipe-smoking refugee had identified not just a flaw in their strategy, but a fundamental blind spot in human perception. His insight would soon save thousands of lives. When Abraham Wald presented his findings, the room was filled with tension. Around the table sat uniformed officers from the Army Air Forces, men hardened by months of reports, losses, and sleepless nights. They wanted answers, but not complicated philosophy. They wanted practical recommendations they could bolt onto their aircraft and send back into the skies. Wald's calm explanation of survivorship bias felt, to some, like a magician's trick. "You want us," one officer said bluntly, "to put armor on the places that don't look damaged?" The disbelief was almost audible in his voice. But Wald did not flinch. He carefully laid out the logic once again. "Gentlemen, the planes you study are survivors. They show us where damage can be endured. They do not show us where damage is fatal. If we reinforce the fuselage and wings, we are wasting weight on areas that already withstand punishment. It is the engines, the cockpit, the control systems, these are where hits are deadly. These are where armor belongs. The officers exchanged uneasy glances. For weeks, their own engineers had been recommending the exact opposite. Charts, diagrams, and photographs all pointed to the fuselage as the most battered part of the bomber. Yet here was a mathematician, a man who had never flown a combat mission, telling them they were wrong. Weight was another concern. A B-17 Flying Fortress already carried thousands of pounds of equipment. Armor was heavy, and every pound of metal meant less fuel, fewer bombs, or reduced maneuverability. There was only so much room to work with. If they placed the armor in the wrong locations, the consequences could be catastrophic. Wald anticipated this. He came prepared with calculations showing that armor distributed according to his method would not only save more planes but would require less material overall. 1,200 pounds of armor, placed where it matters most, he explained, will protect these aircraft more effectively than 2,000 pounds spread across areas of lesser importance. It was mathematics against intuition. Cold numbers versus battlefield instinct. At first, the generals hesitated. Many were men of action, skeptical of academic theorizing. But others, particularly those who had reviewed the casualty figures, recognized the urgency. Loss rates were unsustainable. If they continued as before, the air campaign over Germany might collapse entirely. They could not afford to dismiss any credible solution. One senior officer leaned forward. "Professor Wald, your reasoning is sound. But how do we explain this to the crews? How do we tell them that we are protecting places they never see damaged?" Wald's answer was simple. Because it is not the damage you see that kills you. It is the damage you never see. Ask the crews of the planes that did not return. If only they could answer, you would understand. That argument struck home. Slowly, reluctantly, the Air Force began to accept the proposal. The process of implementation was anything but easy. Aircraft design was delicate. Reinforcing engines meant reshaping cowlings. Protecting control cables required rerouting or enclosing them. Bulletproof glass for cockpits had to be manufactured, shipped across the Atlantic and installed under combat conditions. Modification centers in England were suddenly overwhelmed, tasked with retrofitting dozens of bombers at a time. The crews working on the ground labored day and night. Mechanics who only weeks before had been patching holes and refueling engines now found themselves riveting new plates of armor, installing heavier glass panels and recalculating weight balances. One technical sergeant later recalled, "It felt like we were trying to fix a car while it was still racing on the track. Planes came in smoking from one mission, and we were told to armor them up for the next." Not all airmen welcomed the changes. Some pilots worried the additional weight would make their planes sluggish, easier targets for fighters, and harder to maneuver in emergencies. A few even grumbled that the modifications were unnecessary, convinced that experience, not statistics, was the best guide to survival. But those doubts began to fade once the first modified aircraft returned from combat. In November 1943, squadrons equipped with Wald's recommendations flew deep into German territory. The missions were brutal as always, but something was different. Aircraft hit in the engines managed to limp home instead of spiraling down in flames. Crews reported cannon shells striking near the cockpit. Impacts that before might have killed pilots outright, only to find that the new glass and armor had absorbed the blow. By December, the data spoke for itself. Loss rates had dropped significantly, even though missions were becoming longer and more dangerous. For the first time in months, bomber crews began to feel a cautious sense of hope. One pilot, writing in a letter to his wife, put it this way, "They've armored our engines and given us new protection in the cockpit. I can't explain it, but I feel safer. Maybe it's numbers on a chalkboard, maybe it's just luck, but the men who figured this out might have given us a fighting chance." What Wald had demonstrated was more than just clever mathematics. He had revealed a blind spot in human thinking, the tendency to focus on visible evidence while ignoring the silent testimony of the fallen. His insight cut through the fog of war with pure logic, and it worked. From then on, the Air Force no longer viewed statistical analysis as a distraction. It became a lifeline. Wald and his colleagues at the SRG were given new assignments, new problems to solve, from ammunition testing to search and rescue patterns. Each time they applied the same principle. Look not only at what is present but also at what is absent. Meanwhile, in Europe, bomber crews continued to fly mission after mission. They still faced flak, fighters, and the ever-present chance of death. But more and more of them were making it home. And with each safe landing, Wald's invisible hand, his quiet equation scribbled in a New York office, was saving lives. By the end of 1943, the air war over Europe had reached a breaking point. Each mission demanded enormous sacrifice, dozens of aircraft, hundreds of men, and hours of grueling flight through skies thick with danger. Yet something was beginning to shift. The numbers, always merciless, always cold, were finally showing improvement. Loss rates, once catastrophic, began to decline. Where earlier missions had ended with nearly 1 in 10 bombers destroyed, the new figures told a different story. Crews outfitted with reinforced engines and cockpits were bringing their machines home battered but alive. Mechanics noted the difference immediately. We still saw holes everywhere, one remembered, but now we were patching planes instead of writing them off. The Air Force seized on this momentum. Modification centers across England were ordered to prioritize what had come to be known informally as the Wald upgrades. Crews worked around the clock, stripping planes down, adding new armor plates, installing bulletproof panels, and shielding critical control systems. Supplies of protective glass and steel were rushed across the Atlantic. The program was not without friction. Some commanders, skeptical of academic solutions, had resisted at first. But results were difficult to argue with. As month after month passed, survival rates climbed. Squadrons that had once been decimated were now returning with most of their aircraft intact. The data spoke louder than any debate. Pilots noticed the difference in ways that statistics alone could not capture. One lieutenant recalled a mission over Frankfurt where flak tore into his left wing and a cannon shell struck near the engine. The aircraft shuddered, but the fire never spread. "We made it back on 3 engines," he said. Before the changes, that would have been the end of us. For crews who lived with constant fear, even a small increase in survivability was transformative. Morale rose. Letters home carried cautious optimism. "They've armored us in the right spots," one gunner wrote. "It feels like someone is finally watching out for us." The impact of Wald's insights soon spread beyond bombers. Commanders began asking whether the same logic could apply to other areas of warfare. If survivorship bias had blinded them in the skies, where else had they been misled by visible evidence? The Navy was quick to adapt. Submarine losses had been analyzed based only on boats that returned to port, ignoring those that never resurfaced. Once statisticians began considering what was missing from the data, patterns emerged. Adjustments to patrol strategies and hull reinforcements followed, and losses decreased. The Army Medical Corps also took notice. Field hospitals had long studied the wounds of soldiers who reached medical care, but these records ignored the men who died before treatment. By asking what injuries prevented survival to the aid station, medics reshaped priorities in battlefield medicine, focusing on interventions that turned near-fatal wounds into survivable ones. Even the British Royal Air Force adopted similar thinking. Their own bomber command, which had endured devastating nighttime raids over Germany, began retroactive studies of loss patterns. They too discovered that the most dangerous vulnerabilities were often invisible in surviving aircraft. Wald's reasoning, born in a quiet room at Columbia, had rippled across the Atlantic. Meanwhile, German forces noticed something troubling. Luftwaffe pilots began reporting that American bombers were becoming harder to kill. Attacks that had once guaranteed destruction now ended with aircraft limping away, still able to drop their payloads. General Adolf Galland, one of Germany's most respected fighter leaders, later admitted that by late 1943, the American flying fortresses seemed tougher than ever. German strategy shifted, with pilots ordered to concentrate even more heavily on engines, ironically confirming the very areas Wald had identified as critical. This adaptation made the skies even deadlier for German pilots. To target engines, they had to fly into defensive arcs covered by multiple machine guns. Casualties among fighter squadrons rose sharply. Every adjustment Germany made seemed to carry a higher cost. By early 1944, the transformation was undeniable. The United States 8th Air Force, once on the brink of collapse, was now capable of sustaining long, punishing campaigns deep into enemy territory. Industrial targets in Berlin, Leipzig, and beyond became vulnerable. The steady pressure on German industry was a turning point in the war, and it was made possible in part by a mathematician who had never set foot in a cockpit. Wald himself never claimed heroism. In conversations with colleagues at the SRG, he insisted that he had only applied standard statistical reasoning to the data provided. But those around him knew better. His ability to see what others ignored had changed the course of the air war. It also changed the role of mathematics in the military. Until then, many commanders had viewed statisticians as abstract thinkers, useful perhaps for logistics but irrelevant to combat. After Wald, that perception was shattered. Numbers were no longer background noise, they were a weapon as real and powerful as bombs or guns. The SRG, once a small, overlooked office in Manhattan, became central to American strategy. Wald and his colleagues were flooded with new problems: how to optimize ammunition testing, how to search for downed pilots at sea, how to allocate scarce resources where they would save the most lives. Each challenge carried the same demand: see the unseen, account for the missing, and let the math tell the truth. In England, bomber crews continued to face harrowing missions, but the sense of hopelessness had lessened. Every man still understood that survival was not guaranteed. Yet when engines sputtered but did not explode, when cockpits absorbed hits without killing the pilots, when damaged planes staggered home instead of plummeting to the ground, they felt the difference. They were living proof that mathematics could mean the line between death and life. By early 1944, bomber groups across England had undergone the full wave of modifications inspired by Wald's analysis. Engines gleamed with reinforced shielding, cockpits sported heavier glass, and control systems were tucked behind new layers of protection. The aircraft still looked vulnerable, still carried scars from combat, but their resilience was unmistakable. For the men inside them, survival no longer felt like pure chance. Hope, cautious but real, began to creep back into the squadrons. The mission over Regensburg. On a freezing February morning, Captain James Harlow led his crew on a raid toward Regensburg, deep in southern Germany. The sky, clear at takeoff, quickly darkened with flak as the formation neared the target. Black bursts erupted all around, shaking the bomber violently. Then it happened, a direct hit to the No. 3 engine. The explosion rattled the entire aircraft. Harlow expected fire, smoke, and the sickening spiral that spelled doom. Instead, the engine sputtered, coughed, and kept running at reduced power. Armor plating had shielded the fuel lines, preventing a catastrophic fire. The bomber limped home on uneven thrust, escorted by fighters that had joined mid-mission. Hours later, the battered crew staggered out onto the tarmac in England, pale but alive. "Without the armor," Harlow told his commanding officer, "we'd have been a fireball over Bavaria. The math saved us." The gunner's window. Another case came from Sergeant Lewis Carver, a tail gunner who manned the rear of AB-17. On a mission to bomb Leipzig, enemy fighters swarmed the formation. A 20mm cannon shell ripped through the tail, exploding just feet from Carver's position. Shrapnel tore into the compartment, but the new reinforced bulkhead absorbed most of the blast. Carver was wounded but survived, carried back to base by his crew. Doctors later told him that without the modifications, he would have been killed instantly. He joked with medics afterward, saying, "I never thought I'd thank a mathematician for my life, but here we are." Shifting morale. These individual stories spread quickly among bomber groups. Crews shared tales over meals, in barracks, and in letters home. The legend of the armor in the right places became part of their culture. Though many never knew Wald's name or the details of his equations, they understood that someone had found a way to give them a fighting chance. Morale rose in subtle but powerful ways. Airmen who once counted missions like a slow march toward death now felt that survival was possible. This psychological shift mattered. Crews flew with steadier nerves, formations held tighter, and missions succeeded with greater precision. Fear never disappeared, but hope had returned, institutionalizing the lesson. Back in New York, the SRG took careful note of these successes. Wald's method was written up, formalized, and circulated among military analysts. The key principle was simple yet profound. When analyzing data, always ask what is missing. Survivors alone cannot tell the full story. The idea soon gained a name: survivorship bias. Though the term itself became common only after the war, the concept had crystallized during those tense months in 1943 and 1944. Statistical officers began teaching the principle to new analysts. They warned, "Do not trust what you see without asking about what you don't see." In a world where lives depended on accurate conclusions, this mindset became indispensable. Beyond bombers. As the Allies prepared for the invasion of Normandy, survivorship bias found applications well beyond the skies. Logistics officers used it when planning supply routes. Trucks that returned safely often revealed less about danger than the ones that disappeared. Naval strategists applied it to shipping convoys, realizing that routes with no recorded losses were not necessarily safe. Sometimes they simply lacked enough data to reveal the hidden risks. Even civilian industries caught wind of these lessons after the war. Insurance companies, economists, and medical researchers began citing the bomber studies as examples of why ignoring missing data leads to dangerous errors. A quiet hero. Through all of this, Abraham Wald remained modest. He rarely sought recognition and often downplayed his own role. To him, the bomber problem was just one among many puzzles he and the SRG had been tasked to solve. But those who worked alongside him knew his contribution was extraordinary. His ability to see the unseen, to flip a problem on its head, had saved countless lives and helped secure the survival of the Allied air campaign. Wald's work also carried personal resonance. As a Jewish refugee from Europe, he knew the stakes of the war in a way many of his colleagues did not. Every mission flown against Nazi Germany was not just strategy, it was a fight against the very forces that had driven him from his homeland. Though he never spoke of it in public, some colleagues believed this deeper connection fueled his relentless commitment. The broader impact. The bomber problem became one of the most famous examples of statistical reasoning in the 20th century. Historians and mathematicians would later hold it up as a classic case of how human intuition fails when blinded by incomplete evidence. For the crews who lived it, however, it was not theory. It was armor plates, reinforced glass, and a better chance to hug their families again. Survivorship bias wasn't an abstract lesson. It was the difference between limping home with holes in the wings or vanishing into smoke and fire. By the spring of 1944, the Allies were preparing for the largest invasion in history. D-Day loomed, and the skies over Europe would once again be filled with bombers. Thanks to Wald's insight, many of those bombers would make it back, carrying men who owed their survival to mathematics scribbled on a chalkboard thousands of miles away. The men who climbed into flying fortresses each morning rarely thought about equations or probability. They thought about flak German fighters and whether they'd see another sunrise. Yet, unknowingly, their fates were being shaped by someone who never once set foot inside a bomber. Two worlds, one mission. On one side of the Atlantic, airmen braved the skies, counting bullet holes and praying engines would hold together. On the other, in a quiet Manhattan apartment repurposed as an office, scholars hunched over chalkboards, sketching diagrams that seemed far removed from combat. But the line between those worlds was shorter than it appeared. Each diagram drawn in New York translated into a plate of steel in England. Each formula written by a refugee professor became the margin between life and death for men flying over Berlin. Though the crews never met the mathematicians, they carried their work into the skies on every mission. In a way, the mathematicians were invisible crew members, riding along in spirit, shielding them through logic rather than guns. The crews begin to notice. Pilots, bombardiers, and gunners didn't know Wald's name. Most simply referred to the changes as the new mods. But they felt the difference. First Lieutenant Harold Morgan, who flew 23 missions in early 1944, described the shift in a letter home. "They've started adding armor to places we never expected. Engines, cockpit, control lines. At first we thought it was nonsense. But after Leipzig, when shrapnel shredded the armor around my pilot's seat and left him only with bruises, I stopped doubting. Whoever thought of it knows what he's doing." This sentiment grew across the 8th Air Force. Skepticism slowly gave way to trust, not in a person, but in the unseen intelligence behind the changes. Numbers against fear. Fear was the constant enemy of bomber crews. Every mission was a roll of the dice. Men developed rituals, lucky socks, pre-flight handshakes, even quiet prayers whispered before engines roared to life. But numbers provided something stronger than superstition. Loss rates, once climbing relentlessly, now showed signs of decline. Airmen paid attention. They knew statistics as intimately as they knew the weight of their gear. Each percentage point drop in losses meant more friends returning, more barracks bunks filled at night. "Numbers don't lie," one crewman remarked. "If the odds are shifting in our favor, someone's doing something right." The mathematicians carry their own burden. Back at the SRG, the mood was far from celebratory. Every new box of reports delivered from England carried fresh lists of casualties alongside the damage diagrams. Wald and his colleagues studied them with a kind of grim reverence. To them, the bullet holes were not abstract data points. Each one meant men had been under fire, lives risked or lost. Wald reportedly smoked his pipe in long silences as he worked, burdened by the knowledge that his calculations were measured in lives saved or wasted. A fellow statistician once said, "We carried no rifles, but we felt the war pressing down on us every day. Our mistakes would be written in blood." The invisible bond. Though they never met, there was a strange bond between the analysts and the crews. Soldiers carried armor devised by men they would never know. Analysts stared at damage reports that bore the fingerprints of crews they would never meet. One young navigator, after surviving a near-fatal mission thanks to reinforced cockpit glass, wrote in his diary, "Someone back home thought of this. He doesn't know me and I don't know him. But I owe him my life." That's a kind of brotherhood too. Lessons spreading beyond the skies. By mid-1944, the principle of survivorship bias began to influence areas far outside bomber strategy. Army medics realized that field hospitals only saw the wounded who survived long enough to reach them. Fatal injuries were missing from the data, creating a skewed picture of battlefield medicine. Adjusting treatment priorities saved countless soldiers who might otherwise have been ignored. Naval officers began questioning why certain ships seemed to survive repeated convoys while others vanished without a trace. Applying the same reasoning, they realized that safe routes could not be judged solely by surviving ships. Risk had to be measured by what was missing. This mindset, born from bullet holes in aluminum, was quietly reshaping military thinking across every front. A story larger than war. Wald's insight carried a resonance that extended beyond military necessity. At its core, it was about human blindness, the tendency to mistake what we can see for the whole picture. It was about asking uncomfortable questions, not "what do we have?" but "what are we missing?" Philosophers would later point out that this principle echoes in life itself. We are surrounded by stories of success, survival, and endurance, while the silent failures vanish from view. To understand reality, we must search for the missing voices, the vanished lives, the invisible costs. The ghosts in the data. For the bomber crews, these ideas were not philosophy. They were ghosts, the absent planes, the missing squadrons, the empty bunks after missions. Every survivor carried the weight of those who didn't return. Survivorship bias wasn't just a mathematical concept. It was an everyday reality. As one veteran later said, "When you came back from a mission you could feel the bias. You only saw the ones who made it home. The rest, well, they never got counted." Toward Normandy. By the time preparations for the D-Day invasion accelerated, the lessons of survivorship bias were fully embedded in planning. Bombers would play a massive role, softening German defenses and cutting supply lines. Losses were expected, but with armor placed where it mattered most, commanders believed the air campaign was sustainable. The numbers proved them right. When the skies over Normandy roared with thousands of sorties, loss rates remained far lower than earlier operations of similar scale. Behind every safe return was an invisible chain of reasoning traced back to a mathematician who had once been a refugee in Vienna. June 6, 1944, dawned with a roar that shook the shores of France. Thousands of ships moved across the channel, thousands of soldiers prepared to storm the beaches, and above them the sky vibrated with the relentless drone of bombers. The invasion of Normandy, the largest amphibious assault in history, was underway. For the airmen of the 8th Air Force, it was the kind of operation that once would have been almost suicidal. Only a year earlier, sending over 1,000 bombers into the teeth of German defenses would have meant catastrophic losses. But now the odds had shifted. Armor had been placed not where intuition pointed, but where absence spoke louder than presence. Engines, cockpits, control lines, the invisible map revealed by Abraham Wald's question, all carried extra protection. The losses that day were real, but far lighter than anyone had dared hope. Barely 3% of the American bombers dispatched failed to return. It was still tragic, still heavy, but survivable. And survivable meant that the invasion could go forward with the strength it needed, supported by relentless air power. When the war finally turned and Germany surrendered in 1945, teams of investigators combed through the wreckage left across Europe. In fields and forests, in twisted piles of aluminum, they found the missing half of the story. Burned-out bombers lay silent, their engines shattered, cockpits destroyed, control systems torn apart. The areas that seemed untouched on the surviving planes had in fact been the fatal weak points. The data was complete at last, and it confirmed everything Wald had predicted. Survivorship bias was not an abstract theory. It was written in the wreckage, in the machines that never made it home. Historians would later reflect on how many more lives might have been saved had the insight been accepted earlier. Thousands of names on casualty lists represented the cost of intuition, the cost of trusting what seemed obvious instead of questioning the unseen. Yet what mattered most was that the lesson had arrived in time to change the tide of the war. Numbers had saved lives, not by overwhelming the enemy, but by showing the truth hidden in silence. When peace returned, the mathematicians of the Statistical Research Group drifted back into academic life. They resumed teaching, publishing, and pushing forward the boundaries of statistics. For many, the war had been a strange detour into applied work, an experiment in using pure mathematics to solve deadly problems. For Wald, it had been a chance to prove that numbers could touch the real world in ways few had imagined. His methods were refined, expanded, and applied to countless new domains. But the lesson that endured was simple and timeless. Beware of the evidence you see, because the truth may lie in what you cannot. The influence of that lesson spread far beyond aviation. Economists realized that measuring success by only looking at surviving companies gave a false picture, ignoring the graveyard of failures. Doctors understood that studying only the patients who lived through treatment ignored the hidden story of those who died before reaching the hospital. Investors discovered that the funds they praised for their longevity were only the tip of the iceberg, the visible survivors of a much larger field of vanished competitors. Everywhere survivorship bias appeared, it distorted reality, and everywhere the principle that Wald uncovered helped restore clarity. Wald himself remained modest. He rarely sought recognition, rarely told his story. When asked about his work, he shrugged off praise, insisting that he had simply asked a question others overlooked. The real courage, he always said, belonged to the airmen who flew into danger. But his colleagues knew better. They called him the man who saved lives with chalk and thought. To them, his genius was not only in numbers, but in perspective, the ability to notice the silence and recognize its meaning. Fate, however, played a cruel hand. In 1950, just 5 years after the war, Wald was killed in a plane crash while traveling in India. He was only 48. The irony was bitter. A man who had saved so many in the skies was himself lost to the same element. Yet his death only deepened the resonance of his work. Survival, after all, is never guaranteed. Every life is balanced on fragile odds. The tragedy of his passing underscored the very truth he had revealed, that what we see is only part of the story and much is hidden in silence. Decades later, veterans of the bomber crews gathered at reunions, their hair gray, their bodies slower, but their memories sharp. They spoke of missions over Berlin, over Hamburg, over the coast of France. They spoke of empty bunks in the barracks and friends who never returned. And slowly, many came to understand that the armor which had protected them had been placed by a man they never knew, working in a small office far from the roar of the engines. In museums today, visitors stand before preserved B-17 bombers, their skins patched with armor in exactly the spots Wald recommended. Guides tell the story of the bullet holes, of the mistake that seemed so obvious, and of the mathematician who saw what was missing. People nod as they hear it, surprised and enlightened. They walk away with more than just history, they carry a principle that applies to their own lives. Because this story was never only about war. It is about vision. It is about the courage to question what everyone accepts, to look not only at what is present, but at what is absent. In every field, in every decision, survivorship bias waits to mislead us. We are surrounded by examples of success, of survival, of endurance, while the failures vanish into silence. We see the strong and forget the weak. We hear the loud and forget the quiet. To understand reality, we must search for the missing, for the stories that did not survive long enough to be told. Wald's insight continues to live not just in textbooks, but in the way we think about the world. It is a reminder that data is never neutral, that evidence can lie by omission, that silence itself is information if we know how to listen. The planes that returned carried bullet holes that misled commanders. The planes that did not return carried the truth, revealed only by absence. The survivors spoke one story, but the missing told another, louder one. And thanks to a mathematician who saw what others overlooked, that silent story saved thousands of lives. In the end, the tale of bullet holes and bombers is not just a lesson in statistics, nor merely a wartime anecdote. It is a reflection on the human tendency to overlook the invisible. As one veteran said years later, "We thought the bullet holes told the story. He showed us the silence told it louder." And so the legacy endures. In every analysis, in every field where success shines brightly while failure fades into darkness, the question remains: what are we not seeing? What is missing? What truths hide in silence? The lesson of Abraham Wald is that sometimes, the most powerful evidence is not in what survives but in what is gone.